Like I said last week, ethics, regulation and law is desperately important, but because this module requires me and Adam to cover so much more stuff, I've had to cram it all into, I thought I was going to do it in 1 hour, but it's turned out to be more like 3 hours. So I apologise for that, and if you are looking forward to the sociology of journalism, I'm afraid I'm not going to have time to do it. Because this is essentially the final formal teaching session that I'm going to have with you folks this week, because you've got Adam next week and in week 8, and then we've got tutorials for the presentations in week 9, and then in week 10 we've got the presentations. So it's all going to be happening pretty quick over the next few weeks. But let me talk about what I've got planned for you this week before we start worrying too much. So let's open up the PowerPoint, slide 1. Now you notice that I've put the title Media Law in speech marks, and I've done this because the guy who's coming to be visiting speaker in week 9, Professor Bloy, he told me once, and he is an expert, he said that you shouldn't really call it media law because it's not specifically about the media. As you'll notice, the laws that we're going to talk about today apply to everybody. So even if you don't work in the media, you are still subject to these laws. Everybody, individuals, companies, you know, if you run a hairdressing salon, you are still subjected to these laws. You don't have to be a journalist to find these laws relevant. So that's why I've put it in speech marks, because it's not really media law, it's just law, which is very specific to the media. Slide 2, I'm just going to run through about 10 slides from last week just to confirm that everybody knows why we're doing this. So this slide 2 all goes back to this concept of the freedom of speech, or the freedom of expression, which is a more accurate description. So we kind of assume in the West, in Western liberal democracies, which is what we live in the UK, or in most European countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, etc. Much of the what's commonly known as the West, we have this thing that we protect very passionately, this thing called freedom of expression. However, within that, within freedom of expression, there are responsibilities and limits on what you can say and what you can put online and so on. And there are various mechanisms to make sure that we do that. Let me just admit another latecomer. So we have, first of all, ethics, and then we have regulation, which is, as you know, is stronger than ethics. And then you have top of the tree, law. So ethics are kind of like a gentle reminder to be a good person. Regulation are more strict, and these apply to printed media, to broadcast media, to advertising, and increasingly to online. And then the most punitive and strictest limits on what we can do in terms of freedom of expression are encapsulated within the law. And we're going to talk about the law today. We've already done ethics and regulation. So slide 3, let's just take a step backwards, several steps backwards, and just talk about freedom of expression. So freedom of expression is enshrined in a piece of legislation called the Human Rights Act, which came in 1998. So this has been around for as long as you folks have. I think most of you were born after 1998. So prior to that, the law wasn't really precise on these liberties that we have in terms of the right to a fair trial, punishment without trial, and freedom of expression is mentioned in the same breath as these other really important human rights. So freedom of expression, it's article number 10 in the Human Rights Act, and what it says on the right hand side of slide 3, I've given you a little bit more detail on what it says. This is recap, we've done this already, but for the benefit of those who might still be slightly confused by it all or missed a class, I'm going through it again. So Article 10 protects your right to hold your own opinions and to express them freely without government interference. Contrast that with somewhere like Russia, or in some cases Saudi Arabia, or China, or North Korea, where you are not at liberty to hold your own opinions and express them freely without government interference. Next paragraph says this includes the right to express your views aloud, for example through public protest and demonstration, or through published articles, books, leaflets, television, radio, works of art, the internet and social media. So we might take these things for granted, but it's really important. And if anybody tries to restrict your freedom of expression, then you can, in theory, take them to court and you can sue them over it. You can stop them from doing it. So it's really, really important. Hopefully these things will never happen to you, or to me for that matter. But just be aware that there is a law, or a set of laws there, that enshrine these privileges, or these rights, which is probably a better word than privileges. However, slide 4. However, there are restrictions in Article 10 of the Human Rights Act. So freedom of expression, it says, second paragraph, public authorities may restrict your freedom of expression, this right, if they can show their action is lawful, necessary and proportionate in order to, and then there's a bunch of things listed there that that might cause government or other organisations to restrict. I don't know, Olivia. That's a good question, but I know it's been in the press recently. Olivia's just asked a question about hairstyle, about keeping your hair in whichever style you want. I know there have been some restrictions. It's not against the law, but you could argue if somebody says you need to cut your hair, you could say it's an infringement of expression. I guess I'm not an expert in that area, Olivia, but I know there was something in the media last year. It sounds a bit awful, doesn't it, if the government tells you what haircut you can have. Sounds like Soviet Russia, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry to skip on, Olivia. It's slightly tangential to what we're talking about here, but it's still a human right, I think, to dress and wear what you want. But there again, saying that, if you wanted to walk down the street naked, there are laws against that, aren't there? Even, I mean, I personally think that we're all born naked, right? So I don't see what the issue is with naked, but we have sort of collective sort of societal expectations that people wear clothes. But I've always thought that the wearing clothes things, it might say, I mean, Adam and Eve were naked, right? Pretty much, Anyway, we're going off track a little bit. So there are restrictions. So laws in the shaded area of slide 4. There are examples of when your freedom of expression might be restricted, but public authorities have to demonstrate that it is necessary to, for example, protect national security or to prevent disorder or crime. So, for example, you can't go online and say, come on, let's all go down the high street and have a big riot, I mean, that's essentially what Donald Trump did, wasn't it? I mean, not in explicit terms, he did it in a roundabout way. But a few years ago, there was an example of people being taken to court for saying, let's meet down the road. In 2011, there were some pretty bad riots in London and elsewhere. And I think some people were convicted of inciting riot. And so that is a restriction on your freedom of speech if it creates a riot or crime. Protecting health, we spoke about that last week in terms of coronavirus. And the ones that are relevant today, the fourth one down, protect the rights and reputations of other people. So there are laws to stop you basically slagging people off unnecessarily and maliciously. And it applies not just to people in public life, but it applies to teachers. And thankfully it's never happened. Actually, it did happen once in my long career where some students were making comments about one of my colleagues being a bad teacher on, I think it was on Instagram. And they got into big trouble for it. They weren't sued, but they had spoken to by the head of department and saying that it's a very unethical thing to do and it contravenes the student contract. So that's freedom of speech being curtailed, isn't it? You can't say what you want about teachers. See, this is where social media kind of corrupts us a little bit, because in the old days when I was at university, we used to talk about our teachers, but we spoke about them verbally in the pub over a pint of beer. It's very different when you start typing it and sticking it online, because the whole world can see it. It's taken out of context. There's no tone of voice. So it can be really damaging. So hopefully you won't do it to me or anybody else. I hope if you've got an issue with me, you send me an email and we can talk about it. Let's be human beings. So key point in slide 4, there are restrictions to your freedom of expression, and some of those, the rights and reputations of other people, prevent the disclosure of information received in confidence. That's kind of what we're going to cover today. Slide 5. I use the word control on slide 5 in speech marks. The media isn't really controlled in the UK like it's controlled in China, or like it's controlled in North Korea, or like it's controlled in some parts of the Middle East. It's kind of done through restraint. It's done by subtle means, rather than the government threatening to send you to jail for 30 years if you do the wrong thing. So it's done in a more subtle way. So at the bottom, in small print, I've got ethics. So ethics are like kind of encouraging people to do the right thing, to be a professional journalist, to not cheat and steal and do things manipulatively. And then the next level up, the lettering is bigger. Regulation, that is more control than ethics. And the penalties for going against regulation are greater than for ethics. And then top of the tree, you've got the law. Excuse me. So with the law, you can be fined. You can lose your reputation and be destroyed as a professional person for the rest of your life. So it is quite punitive. With the law, from what we're going to talk about today, you can't go to jail, but you can get fined and have to pay damages. So it can be really, really important and relevant to all of you folks as well with your social media activities. Slide 6, just a reminder, ethics. These are kind of like the mild restrictions. These are all about doing the right thing, the good and the bad. Is it proper? Is it right? Is it wrong? A lot of this is based on religious principles. But there again, as we found, different religions have different ethical codes. Different professions have different ethical codes. So ethics, in some cases, in a large number of cases, is a matter of opinion. But there are principles which kind of run throughout all of humanity, across all cultures, across all religions, about being a good person. Slide 7, we spoke about ethics in the context of journalism. So this is the NUJ, the National Journalists Union, National Union of Journalists Code of Conduct, and this is what journalists they try to stick to these principles as closely as possible. But there are always examples of where you might have to bend the rules a little bit to get a good story, or to tell the truth, or to shine light in dark places. I gave the example last week of journalists who exposed Conservative MPs about 30 years ago, when they were moralising and telling the rest of us that we had to be faithful and be honest and all that. And we found out that they were lying and cheating on their wives and doing fraudulent activity behind the scenes. So a journalist in that case could say, well, it's in the public interest that we know about these people, even though we had to intrude on their privacy, for example, to find the story. So ethics are a little bit fluid. They're a little bit flexible. So long as you can justify your actions and it's in the public interest, you're doing something good for humanity, then most people would not disagree with you if you did bend the ethical guidelines a little bit. So that's ethics. Slide number 8. At the end of last Tuesday's class, I told you the story about the phone hacking scandal in the 2010s, 2011, the Leveson inquiry, 2012, and then in 2014 the printed media in the UK reinvented the Press Complaints Commission, and they set up this organisation called IPSO, which has an editor's code of conduct. And you'll notice some of the same words appear there that appear in the ethical in the slide number 7 with the journalists NUJ ethical guidelines. So, and where are we? Slide 9. So slide 9, we then spoke about Ofcom, which is a statutory body. So regulation in broadcast is stronger than self-regulation in print. So broadcasters have much stricter rules that they have to stick to. Slide 10, I told you about Ofcom on Friday last week. And I also told you slide 11 about the Advertising Standards Authority in Friday's class last week. And what I suggested for homework, I don't know if you've had a chance to do it, but this is a great opportunity for assessment 1, is to look at the codes of practice for IPSO, slide 12, and Ofcom, and have a click through them and see if you can find an example of where a newspaper or a TV company has actually contravened the codes of practice. And that would be a really good idea for assessment 1. So, take one of them, like privacy or harm and offence, or protecting the under 18s on the Ofcom Code of Conduct, and give us an example, investigate it, and tell us a story in 5 minutes. That would be a really good assessment one. Talking of assessment one, we're going to discuss that in greater depth on Friday. So slide 13, moving on. So finally, bringing it up to date, what we're going to do today is talk about law. So law, as I keep saying, is top of the tree. This is the most powerful, and it's the most, in theory, well, in practice as well, the most punitive restriction that we have on the media in the UK. And there are lots of different laws that are relevant to the media, but because of time, I'm just going to concentrate on three, which are in the white box on the right. Defamation, a word that you often hear in context context of defamation, connection with defamation, is libel. And then we're going to talk about privacy briefly, and also copyright briefly. This has been, basically I've decided on these three out of all the laws that we could cover, on the guidance and advice of the great man himself, Professor Bloy, who will be here in week 9 to talk to you about law in the context of social media, which is really important to you folks, because as I said, and as you know, you use social media so often, so much, that you need to know that you're not going to get into big trouble, because it is possible, and I've seen it happen with people not understanding the law in the context of social media. So Professor Bloy said to me, make sure they understand defamation, privacy and copyright. And then when you see him in week 9, he will elaborate and enlighten you about the law and social media. Okay, so that's a recap in 20 minutes of, well, less than that, 17 minutes of what we've done so far. So everything from now on is new, and hopefully I've got enough time. I might have to skip through it again relatively quickly, because as always, too much to say, not enough time, and I need a drink of tea. Hang on a second. Okay, slide 14. First thing I want to do is draw a distinction between these two things. I hope people are making notes, and it's really important. And if we were in class, I'd be able to see if you are making notes. But as you'll notice, there's lots of things that I say that are not on the slides. So you need to make notes to remind yourself. So the first thing I want you to do, folks, is to draw a distinction between two things: criminal and civil law. Criminal and civil law. So criminal, crimes. You know, that's where the word has this, those two words have the same root. So it's something pretty bad, a crime, isn't it? So we talk about theft, we talk about robbery, we talk about murder, we talk about fraud, and all of these awful things, crimes against the person and crimes against the state and so on, you know. So you have crimes, but you also have civil law. Now there's a big difference. Slide 15. Criminal law. So if you watch any of these courtroom dramas on TV, like my mother, she loves that sort of stuff. So when you have lawyers on TV and you have somebody in the dock and they're accused of something and so on, most times that's criminal law. So those are connected with offences, and they are sufficiently serious that they're deemed to be offences against society as a whole. So murder, classic example, you know, is a crime against society. It's not just against the family that were affected, it's against all of them, you know. And fraud as well, and robbery and theft, and all of those things, they are deemed as being not just against the victim, they are against all of us. And the way that it works in the UK is that the Crown, or the Queen, and this is the Queen in her position as the head of state. So the Queen isn't personally involved in the trial, but essentially she represents the law of the land. So the second line, if God forbid I was accused of something, a crime, it would be on the official document it would say R versus Merrill, so that's not my last name, and R stands for Regina, which is the Latin word for queen, or Rex, which is the Latin word for king, if there's a king sitting on the throne. It sounds all really archaic, doesn't it? But essentially, if you're accused and charged with a crime and you go to court, it will be you versus the Queen. The Queen represents the state. The Queen represents society. And what lawyers need to do in a criminal case, they have what's called a very high burden of proof. So they have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you did it. So if it's something like theft and you rob somebody in the street and it's on you know, CCTV camera and there's lots of witnesses and it's definitely you. They can prove that. And you've probably seen it. There have been some examples on TV recently of real life crime. Not played by actors, actually played by the real detectives who've done it. And they're quite intriguing to understand how much proof they actually need to convict somebody. So forensic evidence, you know, hair, fingerprints, blood, that sort of stuff. So terminology at the bottom, those charged are prosecuted. They plead either guilty or not guilty, and they're either convicted or acquitted. And if they're convicted, they will either be jailed or fined, or they might get a suspended sentence or something. So that's criminal law. That's criminal law. So what we're talking about today is not criminal law. So put that to one side. What we're talking about, slide 16, is civil law. Civil law is concerned with resolving disputes between individuals and organisations. So between me and the Daily Mail, for example, or between me and, I don't know, Rupert Murdoch, for example. That's civil law. So the Queen's not involved. The state's not involved. And the second point is that a more modest burden of proof is required than in criminal cases. The case is still viewed in front of a judge and in sometimes a jury, but the lawyer has a lower burden of proof to convict, to basically demonstrate that the person is liable for whatever he or she's been charged of. So it's the balance of probabilities rather than the beyond reasonable doubt. And also when you see these things reported in journalism, you'll notice the terminology is different in civil cases. So you have, instead of having the accused, you have claimants who sue a respondent or a defendant, and then the respondent either admits or denies liability. So there's no conviction, you know, and there's no guilt or not guilty or not guilty. And if found liable rather than guilty, the judge will order that damages are paid. So do you see the difference? There's a difference here between civil law and criminal law. Really important that you understand the difference between the two. Again, if we had more time, we'd spend a whole class on that. We'd spend 3 hours talking about civil law, but your teacher has done it in 3 minutes. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I hope you all understand, and if you don't, you can come back over the PowerPoint and listen to the recording, and you can do more research online if necessary. Okay, so the first, slide 17, the first law or legal concept we're going to talk about is defamation. So this is civil law. Just remember, it's civil. It's not the Queen versus me or the state versus you. It's you versus somebody else, another individual or another or an organisation. So it can be a media organisation or a non-media organisation. It could be Tesco against somebody. So this is defamation. So what defamation means, defamation is a public statement that can damage the reputation of another individual or party. When I say party here, I don't mean birthday party. I mean a group or a company or an organisation, another entity. So a public statement that can damage the reputation of another individual or party. The verb here is defame. So if you defame me, you could, for example, I hope you don't, but you could go online and say, Gary is the worst teacher I've ever had. I'm amazed that he's ever got a job, never mind work for 20 years in academia. That is a defamatory statement because you are casting aspersions on my ability to do my professional job. Okay, now whether that statement is justified or not is another matter, but it is defamation. So if a statement can damage the reputation of another individual or party in a public medium, then that is called a defamatory statement. So if you write a restaurant review about your local chicken shop and you said the chicken was revolting, it was disgusting, I can't believe that they can charge £5.50 for that, that's a defamatory statement. It doesn't mean you can't say it. We'll come on to that in a moment, but it is, on the face of it, a defamatory statement. Slide 18. So why do we have law? Why do we have law? Why do we need a law about defamation? Well, it's very simple, because we need to strike a balance. We need to strike a balance between individuals and media organisations' right to say what they think and what they believe, right? So we need a balance between protecting the individual, both morally and professionally, from unjustified attack, We have to balance that against the right and the human right to have freedom of speech, the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to expose wrongdoing. So if you say something bad about somebody, it might be because they're doing something really bad, or they're doing something which contravenes their professional codes of conduct. And therefore it will damage their reputation, but they might actually be, it might be justified. For example, if you say something about Boris Johnson, and there've been lots of criticism about Boris Johnson, you know, and there's lots of reasons to criticise him. Personally, I don't think he's great at doing speeches, and he's a pretty good journalist, but I don't think he's Prime Minister material. That's me personally, and I think one reason is he doesn't seem to be able to concentrate, you know. He reminds me of quite a few students I've had over the years who kind of don't show up, and then they show up at the last minute and submit their essay, and somehow they get a great mark because he's actually quite a bright bloke. But his attention to detail isn't very good. You know, he skips meetings and things like that. So I could write an article about that, and it would be defamatory, but he would never sue me for it because it's what you call fair comment. You can make comments about your politicians and so on. The big question, of course, is where is that dividing line? At what point does a defamatory statement become unjustified? And that's why we have laws. That's why we have this law. Okay, and the point at the bottom, the law provides defences. The law provides reasons why somebody can make defamatory statements, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So it doesn't mean you can't make defamatory statements. That's really important you understand that. Just because we have a law, it should not stop you from being critical. Okay, so folks, you can criticise your politicians. You can, I mean, there are ways of criticising your teachers. We have the programme board. You know, there are mechanisms involved where you can criticise me or somebody else, but don't do it on social media because it's opening up a huge can of worms and you could get into serious trouble. Okay, so that's why we have the law. We need to strike the balance. Slide 19. So libel. Libel is essentially a word which you'll hear a lot in the context of defamation. So what libel is, the definition. Libel is defamatory material in permanent recorded form highlighted in a newspaper, a book, a TV, radio programme, a website, a blog, a drawing, even a letter sent from one individual to another. Even a letter sent from one individual to another. So the key point here, highlighted, it's permanent recorded form. And you can say, well, you can delete a website, you can delete a blog. Yeah, but there are also ways of undeleting them, you know, and technicians can undelete blogs. It's quite scary. So you have to be really careful about what you write on blogs, on Instagram, on Twitter, because even if you delete them, there are ways that a clever technician, perfectly within their rights, if you've defamed somebody, they can track that down. So the key point is don't say it in the first place, unless you've got a good defence. So think about the adjective as well. So if you hear the word, if the phrase, that is a libelous statement, that means the statement that you've just made is defamatory. So that's libel. For example, slide 20, if someone writes something in a newspaper, magazine or website that damages someone else's reputation or trade, or a company's reputation or trade, and which can be proven to be false in a court of law, then the creator of that statement or the writing and the media, so it's not just you as the journalist, it could be your publication as well, can be sued. If found guilty, the court may order financial compensation, otherwise known as damages, to be paid. So if you say something and it's false, the person that you said it about can, it's within this law that we have, the defamation law, allows that person to launch a lawsuit against you, which will be heard in front of a judge, and if the judge finds in their favour, you will be forced to pay damages, and they can be considerable. It also applies to not just words but images, videos, radio, podcasts, and I've not put it here, but I guess memes as well. So if you do like a little cheeky meme and you and your mates think it's hilarious, it could actually be libelous. So you need to be careful. There is some good news here, folks, so don't get too frightened by all this. Slide 21, don't confuse it with another word. And some people use these two words as synonymous, and they're not. They're similar, but they're not exactly the same. So slander is the same definition as libel, so it's a defamatory statement, but it's in impermanent form. And this is why I always go back to it. This is why pubs were such a good idea and why they still are. because you can sit down with your mates in a pub and you can chat about something like your teacher or whatever, and you all get it out of your system. Nobody's written it down, nobody's got their camera out and filmed it, and you just have a good old laugh and you have a drink and you move on to the next whatever it is on your exciting schedule. Okay, so you could do that. You could discuss me in a pub, and that would be slander. But I've got no evidence. There's no permanent record of it. There's none of my colleagues are listening or could hear what you're saying. And the reason is that slander doesn't really fall into the same category, is because it's speech. It's transient. It comes and goes. It's not recorded. So slander is actually different. So slander is basically if you say it. Libel is if you record it in words or images or film or websites or whatever. Slide 22, one of the really most famous libel cases in history, and I've put the YouTube link at the bottom. If you've got the time, I would recommend watching the documentary about this, because it's absolutely fascinating. And it's really inspiring as well. So what happened, late 1980s, these two people that you see in the photograph, Helen Steele and Dave Morris, they were members of an organisation called London Greenpeace. And in the late 80s, before the internet, they produced leaflets. They did some research and produced leaflets about the environmental record of McDonald's, which was poor at the time, the working practices of McDonald's workers, which was poor at the time, and the nutritional value of the food, which was poor at the time. And they produced these leaflets, and they handed them out outside McDonald's in North London. McDonald's decided to sue them for libel. So here's this massive organisation who was well known at the time for suing anybody who criticised them. And they hit Steele and Morris with this libel case. And to their amazement, Steele and Morris basically said, yep, bring it on, see you in court. And they defended themselves. They couldn't afford lawyers. So they defended themselves and they went to court. The case ran for 10 years. And they were still doing their job. I think Dave was a postman, and I'm not sure what Helen did. But real humble members of society. But they hated the idea of being kicked around by this big corporation. So it really backfired on McDonald's, because McDonald's then had to go to court and prove that they weren't all these bad things. And Helen and Dave had done great research, and they proved in some cases that McDonald's were a bad employer and bad for the environment, etc., etc., etc. So it's a fascinating story, and essentially what happened, the judge found in favour of McDonald's on a couple of counts, but Dave and Helen won a couple of the others. So it's kind of like a 1-1 draw in the end. But it's a fascinating story, and it's an inspiration to all of us that you can take your case, stand up to the big guys in a court of law. Second example, which again was a shameful episode by the media. I don't know if you know this story. It's about 2010, 2011. It's a tragic story. A young student in Bristol called Joanna Yates was murdered. And nobody, the police didn't know who it was, but they had various suspects in mind. And the first suspect was this guy, this rather strange-looking guy called Chris Jeffries. And basically the media, 8 newspapers, over a period of months, they published a total of 40 articles about this guy, who all insinuating and claiming and suggesting that he was actually the murderer. Now, the reason they suspected him was because he was her landlord. She rented a room at his house in Bristol, but also because he was a little bit odd. He used to dye his hair blue and green and that sort of thing, and he read strange books, apparently, and so on. So essentially what happened was 8 newspapers published 40 articles, and when they finally found the killer, who happened to be her ex-boyfriend, which is quite normal in murder cases, tends to be somebody you're very close to, Chris Jeffries sued these 8 newspapers for libel because they destroyed his reputation. None of it was true. And I don't know how much he claimed or how much he was awarded in the end, but he really took them to the cleaners, and quite rightly so, because it was a despicable period. The newspapers at the time were behaving very badly. So slide 24, that just gives a little bit more background. The lawyer, Mr. Chris Jeffries' lawyer, said that we warned the media by letter immediately following Mr. Jeffries' arrest in the strongest possible terms to desist, to stop, in other words, from publishing stories which were damaging or defamatory. But the warnings went unheeded, so that's why they sued them for libel. So those are 2 very classic examples. Steele and Morris against McDonald's, Chris Jeffries against 8 newspapers. Another shameful episode, because all of these episodes, they do tend to be quite shameful. Again, a few years ago, I think this was 2012, this was a rumour which started to gain ground, and before you know it, people are naming a particular person as being a paedophile, and that's a pretty serious claim. If somebody suggests that somebody is a paedophile, that is extremely defamatory. Now, if that person is a paedophile, then clearly that person needs to be arrested and convicted. But there was no formal evidence. It was a rumour which just gained ground. And it was so ridiculous that, as the headline says here, the programme that was involved was called Newsnight. You might know them, BBC 2. And it was such a catalogue of errors that the Director General of the BBC eventually resigned in shame, essentially, because he should have put a stop to it. So all the way through the management of the BBC, there were failures. And the essential reason is that this individual was defamed. Slide 26, that's the person on the right hand side. That's a guy called Lord Mcalpine, who was a senior member of the Conservative Party. And essentially what happened was there was a drinks party somewhere, and somebody suggested at the drinks party that this rumour might be true, that Lord Mcalpine was a paedophile. And you know, the phrase the Twitterati, the people on Twitter all started discussing it and suggesting that, you know, that not in direct ways, but suggesting that it might be true that Lord Mcalpine was actually a paedophile. Incidentally, Lord Mcalpine is now dead, and one of the things about libel is that you can't libel somebody who's dead. So I'm not contravening any rules here by talking about it. Anyway, one of the people who was most instrumental in it was this woman on the left-hand side called Sally Burko. Sally Burko was quite famous about 10 years ago, not just for this, but she was also, and I think she still is, the wife of a senior Conservative politician who used to be Speaker of the House of Commons, called John Burko. I think Sally Burko was on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. She's that kind of celebrity, you know. She hasn't actually done anything of any note. She's married to a famous person and went on one of these celebrity programs. Anyway, she tweeted, "Why is Lord Mcalpine trending? Innocent face." And believe it or not, folks, that was sufficient for her to be sued for libel. Sued for libel because it satisfied the requirements of being a libelous statement, because obviously it's damaging to reputation. It's not direct, it's a hint, but it's strong enough, and also it's in a permanent form. It was on Twitter. So slide 27, I'll just skip through this, but it's really terrible how it happened. And this just shows, see, in the old days, a rumour would just spread around the pub and nobody would write anything about it. But these days with Twitter, people feel compelled to put their thoughts online. So it says that a hum of online chatter grew to a buzz as individuals vied with each other for 140-character remarks. Sally Burko said that, George Monbiot said that. And then 70-year-old Mcalpine was then driven from his home after coming under siege from journalists, photographed packing up and leaving with his suitcase. But the profoundly embarrassing truth was that the story was false. So this is a false accusation. A false accusation. Slide 28. Within 24 hours, his accuser, this person called Messam, had retracted and apologised for a case of mistaken identity. The future of Newsnight, because Newsnight reported it, so they're complicit as well, the TV programme. And George Entwistle, the BBC Director General, resigned. He'd only been in the job for 54 days. So this just shows you how easy and how treacherous that the waters can be with defamation. So spreading rumours online, you could be sued for doing so. So you have to be really, really, really careful. And yes, so slide 29, there's the example. You can see, you can check, if you're interested, you can check out the link. It's at the bottom there from The Guardian. And also slide 30, it wasn't just Sally Burko. It was also slide 30, this guy, Alan Davis, comedian. Apparently, I don't find him really that funny. My mum likes him, but I don't. But he joined in on Twitter. He had 450,000 followers. And he said any clues to who the Tory paedophile is. He subsequently retweeted a response naming Mcalpine. So even retweeting, you can set yourself up for libel. It's quite frightening, isn't it, when you think about it? You have to be extremely careful. Professor Bloy will talk more about this in week 9. So let's move on very quickly. The libel, the process. So how does it work? How does it work? So if somebody is libelled, let's say I'm libelled. Somebody, let's just say for sake of argument, a student libels me on Twitter. Okay, the first thing that's defamatory, something that says I'm a shit teacher or I'm stealing money from the university or whatever it might be, something which really it reduces my reputation. So why would I'm then the claimant? That's me, the claimant. I need to decide whether to proceed. Now, the reason that I would not proceed is very simple, is that if you go down this track, it can cost a fortune. Lawyers charge, I think I read somewhere recently, about £500 an hour, which is 5 multiplied by 8. What's that? £4,000 a day. And, you know, Dave and Helen, they went to court with McDonald's. 10 years it lasted, the crime. And one of the criticisms about libel is that it's for rich people only. So the majority of us, the humble people like you and I, who are on modest wages, if we get libelled, we can't really do much about it. It kind of stops there because you can't afford the legal costs. The only time that you'll get the legal cost back is if you win the case, but it is actually quite difficult to prove that you're not guilty, if that makes sense. Let's say that the case does go to court. So if it does go to court, second line, the judges decide, the first thing the judge does is he or she will decide if the statement could be defamatory. And in some cases they will read the statement and say, well, actually it's not defamatory at all. But hopefully it would never get thrown out at that stage. And then the jury decides if it actually was defamatory. So there's a subtle difference. The judge decides whether it could be defamatory, and then the jury decides if it actually was defamatory. And then if the respondent is found liable, so if it's a student or a newspaper, then the judge will order that damages are paid. So you will have to pay damages if the judge finds out that it decides, and if the jury decides that it is indeed defamatory. A good example here, or a bad example, it can destroy publications. Living Marxism, a magazine, back in 2000, lost a libel action against ITN and 2 reporters, and the jury awarded damages of 375, which basically destroyed the magazine. So that was the end of that magazine. So libel can be extremely damaging, not just for the person whose reputation is destroyed, but also for the people who make the claims. So slide 32, defamatory statements. What are defamatory statements? A defamatory statement is something that exposes the person to hatred, ridicule or contempt, or causes the person to be shunned or avoided. So accusing somebody of being a paedophile, that's clearly going to cause the person to be shunned, avoided and hatred as well. Or it lowers the person in the estimation of right-thinking members of society. So, just your standard average human being. Most of us are pretty similar, really, in terms of what's right and what's wrong. But across all the ethnicities and religions, we're all, as I always say, we're all children of God, right? We're all pretty much the same at the end of the day. There might be some disagreement, but I think we all know what a defamatory statement is if we read one. Or disparage the person in his or her business, trade, office or profession. But it's all about context. It's all about context. So I come back to this point. It is acceptable to make negative statements about people. In fact, as a journalist, depending on what sort of journalism you're doing, it might be expected that you make defamatory statements. So you don't have to just say nice things all the time. You can say negative things. So, which brings me neatly on to slide 33. Slide 33. So, if you are accused of defamation and you are sued for defamation, I hope it never happens, but you have what's called defences. So if somebody's hitting you with a libel suit, you can defend yourself. And there are essentially 6 ways, possible defences. I'm just going to look at the first two, because the others are a little bit technical. You don't necessarily need to know it. So the first one, obviously, is the truth. The truth. So if you say something about an organisation, classic example was Dave and Helen with McDonald's. They made statements and they demonstrated in court that they were true. That, for example, that McDonald's, the amount of litter on the streets around McDonald's was horrendous, and they demonstrated it. They also demonstrated something about the conditions that animals were kept in before they were slaughtered. So they showed videos of cattle in terrible conditions and so on, and that was true as well. But the key point here is that the burden is on the media organisation to prove the truth of what they printed or broadcast. So it was down to Dave and Helen to prove the truth of what they printed on their leaflet, not for the claimant to prove its falsehood. So McDonald's didn't have to prove that it was not true. It was Dave and Helen who had to prove that it was true. And they did successfully with about half of the charges. Yes, so in libel case at the bottom in the green box, the respondent has to show against the balance of probabilities that the statement is true. You don't have to prove every fact, not every single fact. So if you get one wrong, it doesn't mean you lose. You have to demonstrate that, generally speaking, in the main, that McDonald's in this case were a rather disreputable organisation in how they did their business. So the first defence, so if you write something about somebody that's true, and you can demonstrate that it's true, you cannot lose a libel case, or you will not lose a libel case. The second point, which is really relevant for things like TripAdvisor or book reviews, or going to a theme park or whatever it is what's called honest comment. So you can state a comment honestly. So for example, if you listen to Beyonce's new album and you don't think it's very good, and you think Beyonce has lost her sparkle, you can write that. And Beyonce might read it and get really upset, but she can't really sue you for it because it's your honest opinion. You're not doing it maliciously. That's your honest opinion. That's your freedom of speech, right? So you can say it because you honestly believe it. So as it says in the box here, it's not necessary to persuade the court to agree with the opinion or comment, but the court has to be persuaded that it's an honestly held opinion and that was delivered without malice. So you're not doing it just to upset somebody. You're doing it for your general belief that it's true. And there's a great quote there from a case, Silking versus Beaverbrook newspapers. The basis of our public life is that the crank and the enthusiast can say what he honestly believes just as much as a reasonable man or woman. So this is, the diversity of opinion. So it's okay to say that, Boris Johnson is not very good as a Prime Minister, and you can say why, as long as you explain it. That's what annoys me online when people just say, Jeremy Corbyn is a loser or whatever, and they don't explain why. I want to know why. So long as you explain why, then you've got good grounds for a defence. Slide 36. Examples of the honest comment defence. Yeah, reviews. Think about it. Restaurant reviews. Not everybody's going to like every restaurant. TripAdvisor, gig and album reviews, book reviews, film reviews. As long as you do it without malice, you're in safe territory. So you can say negative things about people and companies and products. There's nothing wrong with that. That's your freedom of expression. But it has to be without malice, without being, intentionally hurtful. You're not trying to destroy somebody, Okay, let's just whiz through. Any questions about defamation? It's quite tricky, and like I said, we need several classes really to go through it in detail. What I'm going to do very briefly is just go through privacy, and I'm going to do it very quickly, and then we'll do copyright on Friday. Okay, so privacy. No questions about defamation. Good. So privacy. So this is another element of the Human Rights Act. So privacy, Article 8. So we've done Article 10, which is freedom of expression. Article 8 is privacy. It says respect for your private and family life, home and correspondence. And in the box on the right hand side, I've expanded it to explain what it means. So at the top it says protects your right to respect for your private life, your family life, your home and your correspondence. Letters, telephone calls and emails, for example. And at the bottom it says this right means that the media and others can be prevented from interfering in your life. It also means that personal information about you, including official records, photographs, letters, diaries and medical records, should be kept securely and not shared without your permission, except in certain circumstances. So, for example, at the university, you've all got files. We've got files with your names, addresses, your marks and all that. We are not allowed, and we would never share that information with anybody. Okay, because it's private, it's confidential, it's between the university. I mean, I can't even get access to a lot of it. So it's information that's kept about you. It's only viewed by you and the university. If the university published that in the Sun or wherever, they could be in serious trouble, and you could sue them for breach of privacy. And I hope it never happens. I doubt if it ever will, because universities generally are very law-abiding organisations. Slide 38. Why is privacy important? The centrality of privacy. Private, it means my personal stuff. It's me, it's my decisions, my life, my friends, my emails, my everything. One's own life, your family, your habits, your communications, your information, they are sacred. This is like freedom of expression. It's a fundamental right in a free society, and they are of no concern to anyone else, unless, of course, you're breaking the law. So if you do break the law and you get investigated by the police, they have the right to be able to confiscate, for example, your computer or your mobile phone and read your messages. So if you do something wrong, pretty typically a heinous crime, a bad crime, God forbid you ever do, but they can go through your records and infringe on your privacy. Compared to authoritarian societies, I don't know if anybody's ever read it, but that book, 1984, that's a dystopian view of the future, written in 1948 by George Orwell. I recommend that everybody reads it at some point. It will change your life. It's where the phrase Big Brother comes from, and Big Brother in 1984 was not a pleasant character. So compare what we have in the UK to authoritarian societies. In China, for example, they are slowly but surely, the government setting up a network of CCTV cameras all over the country, so that your face is captured and stored on a central computer, and it can relate and it can sort of monitor your movements all over, and not just like CCTV in the UK, but they will actually use it, for example, to restrict your travel. So if you're seen at a demonstration, the next time you apply for a passport, you get rejected, and that's really frightening. That's a real severe infringement of privacy in China and other countries as well. Slide 39. The problem with privacy is it can conflict with another article of the Human Rights Act. So, as we know, Article 10, freedom of expression, you can say what you like within limits. Article 8, respect privacy. So what you have here is a conflict between two things. So a journalist, for example, wants to express his or her opinion about you, and that might mean that he or she contravenes your privacy. For example, sits outside of your house with a long lens camera and trying to capture you, I don't know, doing whatever you're doing in the kitchen or whatever it might be. That's an invasion of privacy. So there is a balance here to be struck between freedom of expression, typically of the media, and individuals' right to privacy. And that's something to bear in mind, is that tension, that antagonistic tension between the two. Slide 40, a quick look at the Nuj Code of Conduct. Article number 6 says that a journalist does nothing to intrude into anybody's private life, grief or distress, unless justified. So it's not a blanket ban, it could be justified by overriding consideration of the public interest. So again, if MPs, if politicians are doing something bad behind the scenes, it is acceptable for a journalist, or it can be argued that it's acceptable for a journalist to contravene their privacy, because it's in the public interest to do so. Slide 41, the press and the broadcast regulation, they both have clauses about privacy. On the left-hand side, ipso, the second point on the list, it says accuracy number 1, privacy number 2. Ofcom, they have a section 8 on privacy as well. So again, if you want an idea for assessment 1, go to the press and broadcast regulation websites and check out what these organisations say about privacy. And there was a debate a few years ago, slide 42, against a privacy law, and there were a lot of very prominent people, and I must admit I was torn on this one about whether there should be a privacy law or not. Part of me said there should be as a human being, but part of me as a journalist was saying that we shouldn't have one because it's a dangerous precedent. So my concern, and other people's concern, against the privacy law was, what about investigative or campaigning journalism? So journalism, not just reporting what's going on in the world, but actually digging around and finding out what powerful people are doing on our behalf, how they're spending our money, and what they're getting up to, because some of them are a bit dodgy, and I'm sure you know that. Undercover journalism, exposing, there was a great story recently about exposing paedophilia, and that involved contravening people's right to privacy. The Freedom of Information Act was a piece of legislation that came out about 20 years ago, and that was used to invade MPs' privacy, because they were basically swindling the public out of loads of money. It was a very, very famous case, 2009, but that involved infringing on people's privacy. And more than anything else, point 4, holding the powerful to account. As I've said before, if MPs and politicians and senior people are pontificating and moralising about how we, the rest of the population, should run our lives, and then we find out that they're incredibly hypocritical. There is a case there in the public interest to intrude on their privacy, to expose these things. So that's the case against privacy. The case for privacy, slide 43, is very graphically illustrated by that photograph of paparazzi. And some people, I find students sometimes, they quite like the idea of being famous. You know, they love it to be on the red carpet and have loads of people chatting to them, taking pictures. But imagine if that's outside your door when you wake up in the morning and when you take your kids to school and so on. That is a severe infringement of privacy when you have the paparazzis and journalists following you around. Slide 44, an extension of the case for free speech. So yeah, so remember, it's free speech and privacy kind of work against each other. So that the media typically say freedom of speech is more important. But the case for a privacy law, there are lots of examples of this. You know, think about doorstepping, as it's called, stakeouts. Think about Princess Diana and how she died tragically. That was the media trying to engage in her privacy. They were chasing her car with her new boyfriend, threw it down a motorway in Paris, and it unfortunately in the end killed her. Long lens paparazzi, when somebody's struggling to get over illness or rehabilitation from drink or drugs, or they're dealing with grief, you still have journalists pursuing people in their lowest, darkest moments, or relationship problems. And then you've got subterfuge, underhand reporting. I think maybe this is what you were talking about, Olivia. So that's subterfuge, recording somebody when they're not expecting it, or filming somebody behind the scenes, or entrapment. There was an example a few weeks ago of an American businessman it was a great film, a businessman called John DeLorean, and he was entrapped, and they tried to convict him of being a drug dealer. But it was entrapment. He wasn't involved in it at all. So the case for a privacy law is to stop all of those things, or at least minimise them, because they can destroy people, and it can end in tragedy. Think about Amy Winehouse. I mean, she was pestered and harassed horrendously, and she unfortunately in the end died far too young. That was a tragic story. So that's the case for a privacy law. The fact is, folks, that we do have a privacy law now, but it has to be balanced against freedom of expression. You know, hopefully you understand that. The media has to be free to bend the rules if necessary. It's a big debate about what's necessary, whether it's acceptable or not. A couple of examples just to finish off. J.K. Rowling, the famous author at the Leveson inquiry. Again, there's a link there. She gives a graphic example of how the press hounded and harassed her and contravened her privacy over the years. I mean, for goodness sake, she's an author of children's books. Why would the media? She's not in a position of power or responsibility. She's not a politician, but they made her life absolute misery. And she gives a vivid account of that. And slide 46, you probably know, hopefully you do, there's been a very famous example recently. Meghan Markle. She won her case, her privacy claim against the Mail on Sunday. It was only a couple of weeks ago. And again, if you look at the case, and you can search online to find out the details of this, basically the Mail on Sunday printed this private letter between her and written to her father. And Meghan's lawyers successfully claimed and demonstrated that was an invasion of a breach of privacy. And they successfully won the case against the Mail on Sunday. The Mail on Sunday said freedom of expression. We're a newspaper. We're allowed to print like that. People are interested in it. Why shouldn't people read about what Meghan Markle is saying to her father? So that was a debate. It was a court case. Went to court. It lasted a couple of weeks. It cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. Thankfully, she can afford it. Actually, in the end, the Mail on Sunday had to pay her legal costs as well. So there's a very recent example. A not so recent example, slide 47. It was about this character called Max Mosley. Read about that if you want another example. Slide 48, there's another hyperlink there to a great programme on BBC4 called Law in Action. That's all about social media. And finally, slide 49, another great programme called Unreliable Evidence, presented by Clive, what's his name? What's he called? I've forgotten his name. Clive Anderson. Talking about how free our speech is. So the reason I put all these links in, folks, is that you personally need to now go away, click on those links, listen to them with a pen and paper, and come up with an idea for assessment 1. Okay, so what we're going to do on Friday, skipping forward, we're going to do all that stuff, all the stuff on copyright. So the end of this presentation we'll do on Friday. But if you go to slide 59, what we're going to do on Friday is I'm going to give you lots of guidance for your assessments. The key point is, folks, I can't do it for you. You have to come up with the idea. Don't forget, you're going to get assessed partly on originality. So we need a good idea. I cannot do that for you, but I have given you loads of hyperlinks, loads of resources, loads of podcasts to listen to, loads of hints and tips and guidance over the last 5-6 weeks. So you need to take one of those ideas and convert it into assessment 1. And we'll talk more about that on Friday. So apologies to go over time, folks. Apologies for talking too quickly. You can listen to it again. You can go through the PowerPoint again if you missed anything. Does anybody have any burning questions? Shout them out or type them down. Is it a bit scary? That's what I thought when I first started looking into this. It's a bit scary, isn't it? You know, but there again, we have to have these laws, because if we didn't have them, can you imagine what it's like if we didn't have these laws? Privacy would be intruded upon constantly by the newspapers, and people would just be printing crap about everybody else. And so we do need these restrictions to a point. Any questions? I presume that your silence, folks, means that you're all relatively happy. Thank you, Amina. Thank you. I'm sorry, Olivia. I don't know whether I answered your questions, but you've always got one thing to congratulate you on, Olivia. You've got a very active mind, so that's good. I encourage that. But sometimes the questions are a little bit outside of my sphere of knowledge. But hopefully, yeah. But my answer to you, Olivia, and everybody else is, if you're interested in this, I hope you are. Click the links, do more research, find out more about it. That's what university education is all about. A university teacher, basically, think about me as being somebody who opens the door and shows you the way. Right, so I'm pointing you down a corridor and saying, you go and check out that room, check out that room. I can't check those rooms out for you. At school, the teacher would go and open the door of the rooms and explain it to you. We're not at school anymore, this is university. Thank you, Nicola. If everything was clear, I've done my job. Thanks, Olivia. So see you all on Friday. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Diab.